Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Wichita and Kansas government and public affairs. We're broadcast on KGPT channel 26.1, also its companion website, kgpt26.com. Some of you may know me from my blog, The Voice for Liberty, on the internet at wichitaliberty.org. The motto there is individual liberty, limited government, and free markets in Wichita and Kansas. If you'd like to learn more about the issues covered today or to contact me, well, just visit wichitaliberty.org. You can subscribe to the email newsletter, you can like The Voice for Liberty on Facebook, and follow me, Bob Weeks, on Twitter. Well, sometimes I'm astonished by the things that people in civic leadership positions say. And recently we were told that if local governments don't fund arts, we risk a Soviet-style existence. But this line of thought is precisely backwards. Well, here's what happened. Facing the possible loss of funds from Sedgwick County, the Wichita Arts Council painted a bleak future for Wichita, as reported in the pages of the Wichita Eagle. The Eagle said the Wichita Arts Council receives approximately $14,000 from the county, which it uses to provide seed money for startup art projects, President Arlen Hamilton said. It also receives about $6,000 from the city, he said. And without us being there to provide that start, many of these things would never get off the ground, and we'd end up with more of a Soviet-style society than the bright, colorful, and educational environment that we get to live in instead. And that's what the Wichita Eagle reported from the Wichita Arts Council. But this line of reasoning is precisely backwards. When government taxes us and turns over the funds to a group of elitists to make decisions about which art is desirable and which is not, well, that is characteristic of totalitarian socialist societies like the former Soviet Union. In a civil society, people do not expect others to be forced to pay for things like this. Now, defenders of government spending on arts say, oh, it's just a small amount of money, just seed money, they say. But the seed money effect is precisely why government should not be funding arts. David Bose of the Cato Institute explains. He wrote, defenders of arts funding seem blithely unaware of this danger when they praise the role of the national endowments as an imprimatur or seal of approval on artists and arts groups. Jane Alexander says the federal role is small but very vital. We are a stimulus for leveraging state, local, and private money. We are a linchpin for the puzzle of arts funding, a remarkably efficient way of stimulating private money. And drama critic Robert Brustein asks, how could the National Endowment for the Arts be privatized and still retain its purpose as a funding agency functioning as a stamp of approval for deserving art? And David Bose says, I suggest that this is just the kind of power no government in a free society should have. Yes, the leveraging effect of seed money means that elitists like the members of the Wichita Arts Council have great power in deciding who will succeed in the arts in Wichita. By choosing to spend a relatively small amount of taxpayer funds, perhaps an artist is noticed and then receives other government money and perhaps private sector money too. We give up a lot when we turn over this power to government bureaucrats and Arts Commission cronies. And contrary to the argument of the Arts Council president, arts thrive in markets where people are free to choose, but they stagnate under taxation and bureaucracy. Well, in Wichita, we're entering the time of the year when the city budget is prepared. And I'm sure that you will soon be told that the city of Wichita has not raised its mill levy, that is, the rate at which property is taxed, in many years. But data shows that the mill levy has risen, and furthermore, its use has shifted from debt service to current consumption. Well, in 1994, the city of Wichita mill levy was 31.29. In 2014, it was 32.65. This comes from the city's comprehensive annual financial report, also the Sedgwick County Clerk's Office. So that's an increase of 1.362 mils or 4.35% since 1994. And this chart shows the annual change and also the cumulative change in the mill levy over time. So the mill levy, again that is the property tax rate, has risen. Now the Wichita City Council did not take explicit action to raise this rate. Instead, the mill levy rate is set by the county based on the city's budgeted spending and the assessed value of taxable property subject to Wichita City taxation. And while the city does not have control over the assessed value of property, it does have control over the amount it decides to spend. Now, I know that some may say that an increase of 4.35% over 2 decades is not very much. But this is an increase in the rate of taxation, not the actual tax revenue. The actual tax dollars collected is a function of the mill levy rate multiplied by the value of taxable property. And tax revenue has risen, due both to appreciation in the value of property and an increase in the amount of property. Also, the allocation of city property tax revenue has shifted over the years. A few years ago, the city temporarily shifted some tax revenue from debt service to current consumption spending. And as you can see in this chart, the recent trend is that less tax money is dedicated to paying off debt. And this is at the same time that our level of debt is rising. Now, this shift has not caused the city to delay paying off debt in the sense that the city is still making its scheduled payments. But we should recognize that property tax revenue that could have been used to retire debt has instead been shifted to support current spending. And instead of spending this money on current consumption, including economic development spending that has produced very little result, we could have, for example, used some of that money to purchase some of our outstanding bonds and reduced our debt. By the way, when I presented this information to the City Council a few years ago, the mayor, Carl Brewer it was at that time, well, he didn't believe what I said. He asked the city's former director of finance if what I had told the council was correct. She said no, that I was wrong. But eventually a city budget analyst told the mayor that the information I presented was correct. There's video of this at wichitaliberty.org, and it's really astonishing to realize the low level of knowledge of some of our elected officials and bureaucrats, even department heads. But having uninformed elected officials is not limited to local government. Recently, I was listening to the Kansas Senate debate a tax matter. 2 senators were disagreeing over a key element of the way property is taxed in Kansas, specifically whether rental property like apartment complexes is assessed as commercial or residential property. One senator insisted that apartments are classified as commercial rather than residential property. Well, the answer to this question is right in the Kansas Constitution. Also, you can look at the Sedgwick County Treasurer's Office and see that even our very largest apartment complexes in Wichita are assessed as residential, not commercial property. Still, one senator insisted that apartments are commercial instead of residential property for tax assessment purposes. Now, a member of the Kansas legislature making mistakes during a debate is not newsworthy, except the misinformed senator in this case is the chair of the Senate Assessment and Taxation Committee. I would think he should know these things. His committee is responsible for legislation on this topic. And, well, would you like to hear this senator make this mistake during debate? That's probably not possible, because despite the fact that audio of the Kansas legislature is broadcast over the internet, recordings of the broadcasts are not saved. And speaking of that, as we record this show, our legislature is still at work trying to balance the state's budget, and it's having trouble doing that. The Kansas legislature has had several years to develop plans for reforming government spending, but it did not do that. And now leaders in the Kansas legislature and executive branch tell us the only way to balance the Kansas budget this year is by raising more revenue through taxation. And that may be true, as reforming spending and budgeting takes time to accomplish. Recently, there has been some talk of across-the-board cuts in spending, but I'm skeptical that much will be cut. The legislature that is, they had the time to reform spending, but our legislature and executive branch squandered that opportunity. Now they ask you for more tax revenue. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. One of the popular economic development incentive programs used in many states and in Wichita is tax increment financing, or TIF. When we look at it, we find that tax increment financing disrupts the usual flow of tax dollars, routing funds away from cash-strapped cities, counties, and schools back to TIF-financed development. TIF creates distortions in the way cities develop, and researchers have found that the use of TIF means lower economic growth. Well, here's how tax increment financing works. A TIF district is a geographically defined area, and in Kansas, it's cities that establish the borders. And after the TIF district is defined, cities then approve one or more project plans that authorize the spending of TIF funds in specific ways. Before the formation of the TIF district, the property pays taxes to the city, council, school district, and state, as can be seen in this diagram. And because property considered for TIF is purportedly blighted, the amount of tax paid is usually small. But whatever it is, that level of taxation payments is called the base. After approval of one or more TIF project plans, the city then borrows money and gives it to the project or development. The city now has additional debt in the form of TIF bonds that require annual payments. Now, there is another newer form of TIF known as pay-as-you-go that works a little differently, but it produces pretty much the same economic effect. This diagram shows the flow of tax revenue after the formation of the TIF district and after the completion of a project or development. Because buildings were built or renovated, the property is worth more and the property tax is now higher. The development now has two streams of property tax payments that are handled in different ways. The original tax, the base that is handled just like before, distributed to city, state, school district according to the mill levy rates. But the difference between the new tax and the base tax, which is the increment tax, well, that's handled differently. It goes to only two destinations, the state of Kansas and to repayment of the TIF bonds. And this diagram highlights the difference between the flow of tax revenues. The top portion illustrates the development outside of TIF. We see the flows of tax payments to city, council, school district, and the state. In the bottom portion, which shows development under TIF, the tax flows to city, county, and school district are missing. No longer does a property contribute to the support of these three units of government, although the property undoubtedly requires the services of them. This is especially true, say, for a property in Old Town, which consumes large amounts of policing. Yes, cities, counties, and school districts still receive the base tax payments, but remember, these are usually small, much smaller than the incremental taxes. And in non-TIF development, these agencies still receive base taxes too, plus whatever taxes result from the improvement of the property, the increment, so to speak, or simply they receive all taxes. Now, this rerouting of property taxes under TIF financing That goes against the grain of the way taxes are usually rationalized. We use taxation as a way to pay for services that everyone benefits from and from which we cannot exclude people. An example would be police protection. Everyone benefits from being safe, and we are not able to exclude people from benefiting from police protection. So when we pay property tax, or really any tax for that matter, people may be comforted knowing that it goes towards police and fire protection, street lights, schools, and the like. Well, of course, much is wasted, and government is not the only way these services, particularly education, could be provided. But tax increment financing is contrary to this justification of taxes. TIF allows property taxes to be used for one person's exclusive benefit. This violates the principle of broad-based taxation to pay for an array of services for everyone. Remember, what was the purpose of the TIF bonds? Well, to pay for things that benefit the development. But now the development's property taxes are being used to repay those bonds instead of paying for the cost of government. Now, defenders of TIF will say that the developers will pay all of their property taxes. And that's true, but only on a superficial level. We now see that the lion's share of the property taxes paid by TIF developers are routed back to them for their own exclusive benefit. And in their justification of TIF, supporters may say that TIF dollars are spent only on allowable purposes. Usually a prominent portion of TIF dollars are spent on infrastructure. And this allows TIF proponents to say that money is not really being spent for the benefit of the project, it's being spent on infrastructure, they say. And they say that's something that everyone benefits from, not just the one project specifically. So therefore, everyone ought to pay for this infrastructure. And this attitude is represented by an anonymous comment left at the Voice for Liberty, which contended, the thing is that real estate developers do not invest in public streets, sidewalks, and lampposts because there would be no incentive to do so. Why spend millions of dollars redoing or constructing public streets when you cannot get a return on investment for that? Well, this perception is common, that when we see developers building something like a new store, well, the city of Wichita has built the supporting infrastructure at no cost to the developers. But this is not the way it works. About a decade ago, a project was being developed on the east side of Wichita, the waterfront at Webb Road and 13th Streets. And this project was built on vacant land. I searched for City of Wichita resolutions concerning this project and found that its developers spent over $3 million on things like streets, water mains, sewage lines, traffic signals, and street lights. Infrastructure, in other words. All this cost was being paid for by the waterfront owners themselves through special assessment taxes. The City of Wichita itself paid for none of this. In one item in particular, it may be of interest to you, and that is $1,672,000 for the construction of Waterfront Parkway. To anyone driving or walking in this area, they would think this is just another city street, although a very nicely designed and landscaped street. But the city did not pay for Waterfront Parkway. Private developers paid to construct it. Yes, this is infrastructure that we are told real estate developers will not pay for. But in order to build the waterfront development, private developers did pay for all of this. In a TIF district, these things would be called infrastructure, and they would be paid for by the development's own property taxes, taxes that they have to pay in any case. But outside of TIF districts, developers pay their property taxes plus the special taxes to pay for these infrastructure items. And by the way, do you know who now owns Waterfront Parkway? Well, the City of Wichita does. And who owns the street lights, traffic signals, and water mains? Well, the city owns this stuff too. Private money paid to build this infrastructure, and then it was given over to the city. Within a TIF district, the developer's own taxes pay for this instead of paying for the cost of government like we expect everyone else to do. Well, so why do cities use tax increment financing? Well, generally TIF is justified using the but-for argument. And that is that nothing will happen within a specific district unless the subsidy of TIF is used. But recently, researchers looked at the use of TIF in Chicago, and they found, and I quote, "After controlling for potential selection bias in TIF assignment, this paper shows that TIF ultimately fails the but-for test and shows no evidence of increasing tangible economic development benefits for local residents." These researchers also wrote, "We are able to conclude that the development seen in and around Chicago's TIF districts would have likely occurred without the TIF subsidy. In other words, on the whole, Chicago's TIF program fails this but-for test." Well, supporters of tax increment financing also tout the benefit to the entire city. So what is the effect of TIF on everyone, that is, the entire city or metropolitan region? Economists have studied this matter too and have concluded that in most cases the effect is negative. An example are economists Richard Dye and David Merriman, who have studied tax increment financing extensively. In their writings, they observe that yes, things do happen in TIF districts. Buildings are built or renovated. They write TIF districts grow much faster than other areas in their host municipalities. TIF boosters or naive analysts might point to this as evidence of the success of tax increment financing, but they would be wrong. Observing high growth in an area targeted for development is unremarkable. So the TIF districts we see are good for the favored development that receives the subsidy. Not a surprising finding. But what about the rest of the city? Well, continuing from the same study, economists Dye and Merriman write, "If the use of tax increment financing stimulates economic development, there should be a positive relationship between TIF adoption and overall growth in municipalities. This did not occur. If, on the other hand, TIF merely moves capital around within a municipality, there should be no relationship between TIF adoption and growth. What we find, however, is a negative relationship. Municipalities that use TIF do worse. We find evidence that the non-TIF areas of municipalities that use TIF grow no more rapidly and perhaps more slowly than similar municipalities that do not use TIF. Well, that's a powerful finding. Overall, considering everyone, TIF is not a benefit. Well, the Wichita City Council, as you probably know, is always concerned about creating jobs and is easily swayed by the promise of developers that their establishments will create jobs. Well, Paul F. Byrne of Washburn University has examined the effect of TIF on jobs. And he concludes results find no general impact of TIF use on employment. However, findings suggest that TIF districts supporting industrial development may have a positive effect on municipal employment, whereas TIF districts supporting retail development have a negative effect on municipal employment. Well, so he includes that TIF might be justified for industrial projects but not for retail projects. Well, in Wichita, TIF is primarily, almost exclusively used for retail, the type of TIF district that is found to have a negative effect on employment. Well, these studies and others show that as a strategy for increasing the overall well-being of a city, TIF, tax increment financing, fails to deliver prosperity and, in fact, causes more harm than good. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. One of the government programs that is often promoted as a success is Social Security. I believe the worst thing about the program is that it robs people of the incentive and opportunity to be savers and investors. Instead, they are dependent upon the government for support in retirement. Instead of people investing and having a rooting interest in the success of our economy, we spend time fighting over programs like this. In this video, Caleb Brown of the Cato Institute explains the problems with Social Security.
The federal government is massive, wasteful, and growing larger every year. It's time to downsize the federal government. The Social Security Administration was created in 1935 and operates 3 large programs that provide benefits to millions of Americans: old age and survivors insurance, disability insurance, and supplemental security income. Today, the agency takes up 1/4 of the U.S. budget, spending $914 billion a year, around $7,600 for each U.S. household. Spending on Social Security programs is growing rapidly and contributes to the huge financial problems facing the federal government. The current pay-as-you-go structure of the Social Security program is unsustainable, as the number of elderly people receiving benefits continues to soar. The program has accumulated unfunded obligations of $23 trillion. Unless Social Security is restructured, it will only be able to pay a fraction of promised benefits to future retirees. The program also causes ongoing damage to the U.S. economy. Payroll taxes distort labor markets. Benefits incentivize early retirement, which reduces the supply of experienced workers in the economy. Social Security also suppresses personal savings, which lowers investment and economic growth. The costs of disability insurance have doubled over the last decade, rising so rapidly that the program's trust fund is projected to be depleted 2 years from now. Despite medical advances that aid people with disabilities in the workplace, the ratio of working-age people to recipients has been cut in half over the last 2 decades. Policymakers have repeatedly liberalized eligibility standards, and the current program gives many people a strong incentive to stay on the sidelines. Individuals rarely leave the program and go back to work even if their health improves, meaning skilled and productive people are being lured into long-term government dependency. Supplemental security income is for people with disabilities who have not been part of the workforce, including disabled children. As with SSDI, the complex, subjective, and outdated disability determination process for SSI has created a breeding ground for awarding and continuing benefits to people who are not disabled. According to the Government Accountability Office, SSI recipients who are no longer qualified for benefits rose from $3.8 billion in 2002 to $7.3 billion in 2011. The federal government seems incapable of running welfare programs in a frugal manner and with due regard to taxpayer interests. Responsibility for caring for the needs of the disabled should rest with families, charities, churches, and the rest of civil society. But in the near term, tightening eligibility standards and ensuring that recipients are legally entitled to benefits would reduce taxpayer costs. The Cato Institute has developed a detailed reform plan to partially privatize Social Security in the United States. The plan would transition to a system based on personal accounts funded by wage contributions. Such accounts would be legally owned by individuals and more secure than current promises of government benefits. It would allow various investment alternatives and provide a safety net for workers whose accounts did not provide a minimum level of retirement benefit. Social Security's trustees have examined the Cato plan and determined that it would return the program to full solvency. Cato's plan would bring long-run solvency to the system and would reduce the massive $23 trillion unfunded obligation that currently looms over the heads of younger generations of American taxpayers. For more information about cutting Social Security and other government programs, visit downsizinggovernment.org, a project of the Cato Institute.